Gender-based violence, Thurscant module Furrigan at Bunnyhar Inchkina, and I'm calling on Deputy Mary Lou MacDonald for the 20 minutes.
Ramagat Las Corla. Las Corla Sinn Féin has brought forward this motion this evening to respond to the epidemic of gender-based domestic and sexual violence in Ireland. Violence against women, emotional and mental abuse, and the ever-growing problem of coercive control is a national crisis. It is a social crisis. The state and successive governments have a very poor record when it comes to support and protections for women who have been subjected to violence and abuse by men. The reality is that it has been left to community organisations, to NGOs, to step up, to fill the gaps and to help vulnerable and traumatised women. Organisations such as Safe Ireland, Women's Aid, the Rape Crisis Network, Rape Crisis Centres, local refuges and the National Women's Council do Trojan work with really very little support from the state, and they deserve and merit our recognition and thanks. This is an incredible situation when you consider the scale of the violence faced by women. So here are some of the facts. Hundreds of women have died violently in Ireland. Many of these women were killed in their own homes. Most of these women were killed by a man known to them. The majority of violence, abuse and coercive control of women is perpetrated by men, and 99% of suspected offenders of detected sexual violence reported in 2019 were male. So the crisis that we have is pervasive, continuous, and it's getting worse. Support organisations such as Women's Aid and Safe Ireland have reported a frightening increase in the numbers reaching out to them for help. In 2020, Women's Aid support workers heard over 30,000 disclosures of domestic violence, including coercive control. While Safe Ireland's submission to the Oireachtas Justice Committee stated that nearly 3,500 women and 600 children contacted a domestic violence service for the first time during the first 6 months of the pandemic. So the fact is that the culture of everyday sexism, misogyny and violence against women is systemic. We find it right across our society. And I believe, and we believe, that it is now time for everyone elected to the Dáil and indeed to the whole Oireachtas to play our part in ending this scourge of gender-based violence in Ireland. But there is a particular responsibility and an urgent one that falls on government. Following the brutal murder of Aisling Murphy last week, there has been a collective outpouring not only of grief but of anger too, and a demand for real change. And it is now time, and there is now the opportunity for government to respond in a way that matches the scale of this crisis and the magnitude of violence and abuse against women and girls. So this means coming up with the resourcing and funding for services. The days of the bail booked, the day of services existing and surviving on a wing and a prayer have to be over. It means the passing of legislation and the delivery of policies with a modern and modernising outlook and a genuine determination to make things better. The Sinn Féin motion before the House this evening focuses on practical solutions and on actions that will make a difference in how the state tackles gender-based violence. There are steps that can be taken immediately to turn the tide of a crisis that is ruining the lives of far too many women and girls right across our communities. Our proposals include the need for the government to complete and publish the comprehensive and integrated third national strategy and, crucially, to commit to implementing, resourcing and funding that strategy in full. Policy, legislation, resources and political decision-making relating to gender-based violence is currently scattered across a number of government departments, and we know, and I think everyone now accepts, that this fragmented approach hasn't worked. And I note that the Minister for Justice now will be the singular senior minister to take all of these matters forward, and I think that's a welcome move. However, we have also proposed the establishment of a dedicated unit in the Department of An Taoiseach for oversight and coordination to ensure the implementation of the national strategy and to ensure that all parties to it are held to account. And we believe it still remains important that the Taoiseach, that the head of government of the day, drives and is accountable for this strategy. To better inform policy decisions and response strategies, we're also calling for the publication of the Sexual Violence Survey and for the implementation of the recommendations from the independent study of familicide and domestic homicide reviews. And we've raised this, as you know, Minister, on many, many occasions. This is an urgent matter. I understand that the government is supporting our motion this evening, and that is to be welcomed. It's important that all of us as Teachta Dáil, from whichever political party or from the independent benches, stand together. I believe this is one of these issues that there is, without doubt, far more to bring us together in common purpose than there is to divide us in disagreement, because this is not about political parties and it's not about party politics. This is about coming together to send a message that when this Dáil says enough and is enough, we mean business. It's not a slogan at a time of grief to be cast aside when the time of mourning has passed. Women have had enough of that, enough of promises that go nowhere, and all the while women and girls suffer the awful consequences of this state and too many governments that have been found to be so badly wanting. When we say it ends here, the only way that can be made real is by government following up with actions and initiatives that will bring an end to this scourge of domestic, sexual and gender-based violence, because everything else in the end is just talk. This comes down to political will, to the government grasping this imperative to make real change. And of course that imperative applies to all of us too on the opposition benches. We need, to borrow a phrase, to be in this together. I welcome the fact that the Taoiseach earlier today accepted my proposal that a meeting of political leaders be convened early next week, because I believe the entire political leadership of the Oireachtas needs to commit publicly and vigorously to sustain this matter. We need stamina and we need persistence on these matters. The women of Ireland are crying out loudly and clearly. It's been said, but let me repeat it again, that this can be a watershed moment. And the challenge for us all is to make sure that it is.
I welcome the opportunity to speak on this PMB tonight, and it is absolutely necessary that we do so. As every woman, and I include myself when I say every woman, I have played by the rules. I have played by societal rules, even when I knew that they weren't fair and they were placing a disproportionate burden of responsibility on me as a woman. Because as women, from the time we are young and girls, we are conditioned to develop an awareness that young men and boys aren't. Now think about that. That is very, very wrong. We get advice and we get safety tips that we never ask for. Don't wear revealing clothes. Lock your car door. Always get a taxi, but remember to text the licence number to a friend. Don't exercise with your earphones in. Don't agitate them. And pop 20 quid in your bra on a night out, just in case you get mugged. At least you'll be able to get home. The only real advice, the only real rule that's going to make a difference here is one that states clearly and categorically, stop attacking women and girls. It will not be tolerated. As women, we deserve better. And as a mother, I refuse to raise my daughters in fear. But I want to finish on a very real impact of what gender-based violence is. I went to the doctor today. It was okay. It was difficult, but I'm glad I went. Once again, the label of PTSD and re-traumatisation was given. I've been told I have to stay off work for a minimum of 3 months. I've been referred for an urgent review. That'll happen soon, and hopefully it's useful. I need to get through this time. I need to get it sorted once and for all. I got that message this evening. That woman was attacked in 2004. 18 years she has been living with that trauma.
This evening, my thoughts in the first instance are with Aisling Murphy's family, her friends, her pupils and colleagues at the school and the whole community in Tullamore who have been through an unimaginable heartbreak. The outpouring of grief for Aisling and the tens of thousands of women and girls who have shared their experience of everyday harassment and violence, and the fear of violence has sent a clear message to us all. Enough is enough. We can all see that this is a watershed moment. The causes are deep-rooted and will need serious consideration if things are to change. Women and girls have had the right to be safe on our streets and in their homes too, yet too often they are not. We need to review our society. It is not just an Irish problem, but Ireland can lead the way. From our education system, our health service, our justice system and the social media, they all need reform. We need to fundamentally consider the effect of every aspect of society on our attitudes towards women. None of us want to look back in a year's time or 2 years' time and hear of another senseless killing and wonder why things didn't change. We have a unique momentum which can overcome all obstacles and deliver real change. Sinn Féin's private members' motion outlines the immediate measures government must implement to tackle harassment and violence against women and girls. The third national strategy on domestic, sexual and gender-based violence is due to be published in about 6 weeks. We need a government commitment that it will fully implement and fund this strategy. The current pandemic has exposed an epidemic of domestic violence. In Kildare, things are so bad that women and children are being sent to refuges outside the county, even as far as Drogheda in County Louth. And Kildare might be considered lucky, Minister, because 9 counties have no domestic violence shelter at all, and this needs to be addressed urgently. The Citizens' Assembly on Gender Equality has recommended that a revised relationships and sexuality curriculum should cover gender power dynamics, consent and domestic, sexual and gender-based violence. Change is needed and failure to address this will cost lives. Cormac.
Deputy Patricia
Men carrying out violence against women is the reality the world over. And in Ireland, it's an issue that we need to tackle head on. Women in Ireland experience sexism and harassment in their everyday life, be that either in the gym, on the bus or online. Women face harassment by just being present in public spaces. The vast majority of sexual violence offenders are men, and unfortunately, a lot of the abuse and the harassment isn't reported. For me, that says something about the lack of confidence that women have in the justice system. We fear that we won't be believed. And if we are, that the perpetrator will get off with just a slap on its wrist. The state needs to do more to support women who are victims of gender-based violence. Government needs to fund these services properly. Charities have stepped in where the state failed, and this isn't good enough. The women of Ireland deserve much better. Safe Ireland state that in the last 4 months of 2020, there were over 800 requests for refuge that they couldn't meet. For me, that shows a complete disregard for women who are victims of domestic violence and have nowhere else to turn. Government needs to give a firm commitment that the upcoming strategy on domestic, sexual and gender-based violence will be implemented in full, as well as committing to gathering better data in this area. We need to strive to do much better across all departments in making our public places safe for the women of Ireland. There's no quick fix, but we need to work together and start taking the necessary steps to improve Irish society in the here and the now.
Our nation's attention is currently focused on violence against women due to the horrific murder of Aisling Murphy, and I know that all our thoughts are with her family and her loved ones. But sadly, this is only the most recent violent attack against a woman to horrify our nation. We have a long and shameful history of the treatment of women and girls in this state, and we must be under no illusion that this history has had an impact on the deeply ingrained misogynistic attitudes towards women. We see it in the way that women and girls were treated in Magdalen laundries. We see it in the way women's health care is cast aside, in the way women's bodies, tone, image and behaviour are strictly policed in public discourse, in the way women have been forced to travel to get abortions, in the way our bodily autonomy has been denied to us by this state, in the culture of shame that puts the burden on us to talk about the violence we have experienced in hushed tones, and the immediate and severe backlash and victim blaming if we dare to speak out. We know that 90% of sexual assault takes place within relationships, and we know that we don't have adequate services in place to support survivors of domestic abuse, and this includes refuge space, but it's broader than that. And I've been contacted by women who are trying to get out of their current relationship, but there are economic factors which severely restrict their ability to keep themselves and their children safe. It is so difficult for any person to get away from their abuser, but for women in poverty, for women whose abusers control their finances, for women who are isolated socially, it is all the more difficult. The past week, I've often thought about Manuela Riedo, who was raped and murdered in Galway, and many aspects of Aisling's case reminded me of that horrible attack. Since Manuela's murder, there have been 105 women who have lost their lives in Ireland, and we cannot wait for another woman's murder to tackle the culture of misogyny and to put policies in place to counteract it.
I only have a couple of minutes of speaking time, and it's certainly not enough to speak to the enormity of the problem of violence against women in Ireland. Firstly, I'd like to give my sincere condolences to the family of Aisling Murphy and to her partner and to her friends. Their loss is unimaginable, and we're all thinking of them at this very difficult time. Since Aisling was murdered, we've been hearing an outpouring of anger from women. We know that violence against women, the threat of violence, the fear of violence is pervasive in Irish society. It always has been, and it affects all women, and we've heard that loud and clear. Irish society has reacted to the death of Aisling with revulsion. The calls for change across the country are deafening. This is a decisive moment in Irish society, and we have to take action. We cannot go back to business as usual after this. Women simply won't accept it this time round. And I acknowledge that the government is talking about taking steps to deal with this. The political leaders meeting, the role of the Office of the Taoiseach in implementing change, and that's all welcome. But it has to be backed up with action. Services need to be properly funded. Rape crisis centres need to be sure that they can answer every single call. We need enough refuge places to ensure that no woman is ever turned away again. TUSLA provides just 1/3 of the refuge places Ireland is obligated to provide under the Istanbul Convention, and 9 counties have no domestic violence refuge place at all. Every member, practically every member, has raised that point, and that speaks volumes in itself. We need a commitment that the third National Strategy on Domestic, Sexual and Gender-Based Violence will be fully implemented and properly funded after it's published. Further to this, we need to address wider issues relating to women's safety, family courts, appropriate and safe housing, education for our young people. We need a joined-up approach to bring about real systemic change. And this can't be another case of promising change and not delivering. Women have a right to be safe wherever they are, when they are working, socialising, exercising, and when they're in their own homes. And I hope that we can all work together on this, because it has to happen now. And my colleague, Deputy Rose Conway-Walsh, earlier in the day had asked that this be brought back into the chamber every couple of months so we can discuss additional changes, additional measures and an update on progress. And I'm sure the Minister will agree to do that. Thank you.
My condolences to Aisling Murphy's family and to all who loved her. She certainly lit a fire in Manana Heron, from Derry to Cork and from Galway to Leinster House. But to them, Aisling was just their gorgeous young woman. They wished that she had just come home, and all this must be very difficult for that family. There must be a before and an after Ireland after this. Every woman has experienced degrees of what Aisling and countless other dead women went through. We all feel it. We are angry at her murder. We are broken-hearted, but we are furious too. But we won't be dismissed as men-haters. It is an insult and it's a cop-out. We carried ye, we gave birth to ye, we nursed ye, fed ye, cared for ye. The only reason you're alive is because we love ye. So why are ye so afraid of us? I know you can't live and breathe the patriarchy without learning how to survive, and we've all had to use appeasement to live through dangerous situations. But to the women who encourage misogyny, hoping to get some kudos, just stop. The truth is, the misogynists, they loathe you too. In the beginning, we ate the apple, tempted the man, then we wore the wrong clothes, drank too much, walked or ran alone, out after dark, before dark, after dark. That we were out at all really meant we were asking for it. But we're sick to death of taking the blame, planning our routes home, locking car doors, pretending we're on the phone, wedging keys between our fingers, texting when we're home, safe, safe. We don't want mace and we don't want self-defence classes. We don't want hollow words from a system that waits for the candles to burn out. Then back to normal. A normal where women are beaten at home, money controlled and clothes policed and murdered. A normal that is failing our children and that failed our young Kildare girl, Anna Creagle. Mary Lou has outlined our PMB. We want accountability, 999 calls answered, safe homes, safe streets, refuges when we need it. We want to be valued for what our feminine qualities bring to the table, because we bring what has been missing in this state. We want respect, rights, sovereignty, and to take our equal place in the promised republic, and we'll accept no less.
Deputy Matt Carthy.
And I want to add my voice to the hundreds of thousands of messages of condolences to the loved ones of Aisling Murphy on her tragic death. The outpouring of grief that has followed Aisling's murder has been phenomenal. The spontaneous organisation of vigils across our cities, towns and villages, and the huge numbers of men, children, but especially women who turned up in sympathy, solidarity and anger was simply amazing. And all of us in society, but men in particular, have a responsibility to do our part in ending the violence, the threat of violence, the fear of violence that is the hallmark of the lives of every woman and girl. But all of us in this House have a greater responsibility to listen to those who attended the vigils and demanded that Aisling Murphy's death mark a turning point, to listen to all those women who came on the airwaves to share their own harrowing, often shocking experiences of humiliation, of harassment, of attacks endured while they were going about their daily business. To listen to those in this House who have bravely told their own stories, including my colleague Pauline Tully, who in such an honest and powerful way outlined her own experience of domestic abuse that almost cost her life. Above listening, though, we have a responsibility to act, because it will be by our actions that we will be judged. The counties in my constituency, both Cavan and Monaghan, have no domestic violence refuge accommodation. For years, the Chairman Domestic Abuse Service has appealed for emergency accommodation provision. Their calls have gone unheeded by successive governments. If this government and this House are genuine about the words that have been spoken in the Chamber tonight, never again will Chairman have to make that appeal. The evidence as to whether or not we've listened will be in the delivery of refuge accommodation in every county and the implementation of the dozens of other immediate actions that have been rightly demanded over the past week. I commend this motion to the House.
Deputy Martin Kenny.
The murder of Aisling Murphy, I think, has traumatised people across the whole length and breadth of the country. And we all, our hearts go out to her and her family and to all the other women who have died over so many years at the hands of men. And while we've all discussed all of this for the past week or so, and what comes to us all is behaviour and attitude, and that we can't legislate, if you like, for attitude. But we can legislate for some things. We can legislate for education, to improve it, to ensure that there is proper education for people there and that they know right from wrong from a very early age. We can legislate to tighten sentencing guidelines for violence against women. We can legislate for domestic homicide and femicide reviews, similar to what we have in the north. We can't leave these tragedies without learning from them and making sure that we provide for them for the future. We can also ensure that there's support there for victims to prosecute and that they have the courage to come forward, not afraid that the past experience of others has been so negative that they don't do it, and so many don't do it. Ensure that they have the aftercare, the support and everything in place to be able to do all of that. And the examples, I suppose, of where the holes are in the system, the 999 calls is one example of that. The domestic refuges, which are missing in so many places around the country, is an example of that. There are so many things that we can do in this House to change things and make them better, and we must do them. But of course there's a lot of other stuff out there, and it has been mentioned, and everyone is aware that we need to change the attitude and we need to change the behaviour of so many people around the country. And the last week I was thinking about something that happened. It's probably the most of 30 years ago. Myself and another young man were going through a small town in rural Ireland. We stopped into a chip shop. And when we ordered a few chips in the shop, a group of young men came in the door. And they went up, and there was two young women behind the counter, and they were at very inappropriate remarks toward the young women. And there was an elderly man sitting there. And when this went on for a while, we were sort of saying, geez, this is a bit funny. But the man got up and he laid into them. He said, who the F and hell do you think you are abusing these two girls? This isn't right, and get out of here. And he roared abuse at them. And they went out the door. And about 10 minutes later, one of them came in very sheepishly and collected his few things and left. And, those who say not every man, well, every man has the opportunity to be like that man. And I wasn't like that man that night, to my shame. And many others of us in those circumstances wouldn't be. But we have the opportunity to be. We have the opportunity to stand up and to be counted when things like that happen. And that, I think, is the big lesson that society needs to get from this. But I also come back to the motion that we have here tonight. We have the opportunity now to put in the legislations and the regulations to make things better, and the resources to ensure that the money is there, that the funds is there to provide for all of these situations. Women's refuges and people that are out there trying to help victims of domestic violence should not be spending their time going around trying to run fundraisers. This is a service for the community, a service for the people, a service for every citizen in this state, and the state has to provide those services as well.
Deputy O'Brien.
Corla, I would first of all like to express my deepest condolences to the family, partner, friends of Aisling Murphy, and to the wider community that have been devastated by her brutal murder. Listening to the public debate over the last number of days, one comment has stuck in my mind, and that the issue here is not in the first instance the safety of women, it is the violence of men. Every single day women face abuse, harassment, sexual and physical violence, and in far too many instances death, because they are women. All women at some point in their lives are forced to live this reality, and it is men who perpetrate this violence. Toxic masculinity and institutional sexism are the root cause of the problem. And not just among individual men, but throughout the very culture and institutions of our society, at home, in work, on the sports field, in schools, in the courts, and even sometimes in this chamber. We live in a society that simply refuses to treat women fully as equals. And I want to agree with other colleagues from both sides of the House by saying every single man has a role to play in tackling this. It is not acceptable to stay silent and look the other way. We must all play a part in bringing this unacceptable reality to an end. And I have to say, listening to the testimony of women in recent days has driven home for me that it is time for men to stand up and act. All men. To call out everyday sexism, to educate our sons, our friends and our colleagues, to challenge institutional gender discrimination and, crucially, to fund support services for those experiencing gender-based violence. And most importantly of all, to ensure our streets, our homes, our workplaces and our places of leisure and entertainment are safe for all women. It is time for us men to listen to women and to act and put an end to toxic masculinity. And for those of us with the incredible privilege of being in this chamber, to do everything we can through legislation, policy and budgets to provide all the necessary supports to bring this appalling reality to an end. Thank you, Lescan Corla.
And I also want to add my heartfelt condolences to the family, friends and the wider community of Aisling Murphy. I also want to send my condolences to the families and friends of any woman who has lost their life by the hands of a man. As I've said already, over 244 women have died violently since 1996. The death of Aisling Murphy has brought to the forefront the everyday sexism, violence, harassment and misogyny that women must endure. This is systemic across Irish society, and whilst it's not all men, it is almost always men. For the men who contacted me, who got defensive, who feel that they are being portrayed in a bad light, I suggest that they take a look at themselves. I suggest that they cop on. Instead of becoming defensive, it would serve them better to become a little bit more reflective. Reflect on how your everyday behaviour as a man can affect women. Reflect on how you can change. After all, it's men's behaviours that needs to change, it's not women's. As a father to two girls, as a son, as a brother, and just as a basic human being, the senseless death of Aisling Murphy has shaken me to the core. It is incumbent on all men to call out the everyday sexism, harassment and misogyny that women must endure. Be the voice that says enough is enough. I don't want to live in a society that treats 50% of its population as less worthy just because of its gender. We as legislators and as public representatives must now work together across all parties and none and put in place measures that will lead to systemic changes that is needed. Women's aid support workers heard over 30,000 disclosures of domestic violence, including coercive control, in 2020. We all heard the evidence that incidents of domestic abuse increased during lockdown simply because men were at home. I want to thank Saoirse's Women's Refuge in Dáil for all the assistance that they have given to women and children during this difficult time. There doesn't seem to be a week that goes by that I don't refer somebody into their service. As I said, societal change will not happen overnight, but so in the meantime, what we need to do is to support services like Saoirse's Women's Refuge and all refuges across the country, so at least women will have a safe place to go.
The whole country was shocked by the terrible murder of Aisling Murphy, a young, talented woman who in her short life accomplished so much and who touched the lives of everyone she met. The tragedy of her murder is compounded by the lost potential of this gifted and popular teacher and musician. My heart goes out to her grieving parents, boyfriend, family and friends. My own constituency experienced two tragedies just in the last year with the murders of Jenny Poole and Fabioli Camara de Campos. The community of Finglas was shaken by the extremely violent deaths of these two young women. And just like the community response to the murder of Aisling Murphy, the people of Finglas came out to express their grief and support for the families of the murdered women. Women from every ethnic, cultural and social background experience domestic violence. It can come in many forms, and it is not always physical. Psychological abuse can be as harmful as physical abuse, particularly if a woman lives under the constant threat of violence. It can also take the form of financial abuse. However, the most common form of gender-based violence is domestic violence. It is an indictment on our society that domestic abuse can remain a hidden crime, as many women are reluctant to report it. Substance abuse and the excessive consumption of alcohol is also linked to domestic violence. The lockdowns and restrictions have almost certainly led to increased instances of domestic violence. It is a horrific scenario where a woman in an abusive relationship is trapped with the perpetrator of the violence and abuse during the lockdowns. There is an onus on men to confront and challenge men's violence against women, in particular the casual, everyday harassment of women. What we are teaching about such issues is not working and needs to change. There are supports available from women from groups such as Safe Ireland, Women's Aid, Rape Crisis Centres and the Rape Crisis Network. However, it is sad to say that these supports are only necessary because violence against women continues and will continue until men, the predominant perpetrators of such acts of violence, address their behaviour and society addresses the ingrained prejudice against women so prevalent in everyday life. Thank you.
Look, I've never struggled so much as someone not in this House too long, but to put words together to speak in this House tonight, because it is simply difficult to find the words. This day last week, all of us, an entire nation, was brought to a stop. A young woman with her whole life in front of her, with hopes and with dreams, had her life stolen from her in broad daylight along a very popular walking route. In broad daylight along a popular walking route, a fairly safe choice to make, you would think. Aisling Murphy, another woman killed by a man. And as has been said repeatedly today in this House, and it cannot be said enough, 244 women have been violently murdered in Ireland since 1996. Women who were loved, women who were part of families, part of communities, women whose children had to grow up without them, and their lives mattered. Yet these women, year after year, were murdered, and it is still happening. And that tells us that everything done up to now has not worked. And it is not enough just to remember these women. We have to act, and we have to act right now. Much has been put forward here this evening: reports, data, policy and legislation, all important. But I do believe that moving forward, we have to have accountability on every single action that we will now put forward on tackling gender-based violence. Every month, we should have statements in this House outlining the progress that is being made to achieve zero tolerance of violence against women. We need to show progress, we need to see progress, we need to see the practical steps that are being taken, and I think that the public need to see that too, and we have to start now. In my short 2 years being elected a TD, I have come across a number of instances of violence against women that have highlighted many issues to me. In 2 instances, they showed me the reality faced by women who come forward, women who actually seek help, who seek a way out of violence at the hands of a man in their lives. A domestic violence situation which showed me firsthand the very difficulty that women face in fleeing the family home and in seeking alternative accommodation. Firstly, there is no refuge because County Roscommon is one of 9 counties with no refuge spaces for women. In fact, in all of Roscommon, Galway and Mayo, there are just 14 refuge spaces for women and children. 3 counties with a population of over 228,000 women. Based on the Istanbul Convention, SafeLink have told us there should be 46 spaces for Mayo, Roscommon and Galway. And as I said, there are just 14. And in many situations of domestic violence, there isn't an opportunity to ring your local TD, to maybe go and meet them, to ring others, to reach out. There may be just one chance for a woman to reach out. And that is why it is so vital that those supports and those services are there, and they need to be there in an instant. And if they're not there, then we have failed. And I think when reading through what Safe Ireland had sent us across, the 808 requests that they reference, requests for refuge that they received between September and December 2020, that they could not meet because there was no space. And I wonder, where are these 808 people now? And I cannot imagine what it must be like to be in a domestic violence situation where you have no family, where you have no refuge, and you're trying to support, to secure private rented accommodation, and we know the difficulties that there are in that in itself. I want to welcome the extension, the permanent extension of rent supplement for survivors of domestic abuse. That is important, it is welcome and it is needed, but we need to do so much more. I was also contacted by a woman last year. Her case of rape and sexual abuse went to trial, but once the trial was over, all state support vanished, her words. She told me that while the man convicted and sent to prison could access support, a care plan and psychological support, she could access nothing. She was told of an 18-month waiting list for post-trauma psychological support. And there were just 2 women that I've engaged with in the last year alone. And there are so many more women suffering, so many women living in fear, and too many women whose lives were cut short, and too many times the state has come up short. So I hope, to conclude, that we can work together, and I hope that as women in particular, we can work together to make the changes that are so desperately needed, and that we can lead the way on this once and for all. Gur Mahagat.